then, unless you've been living in a cupboard since the 90s, I'm guessing that you've watched an episode or two of Friends?
I remember actually doing a job, this was in South France, where they had, back in those days, it was when people still had, I think it was VHS, or maybe, anyway, it was the whole series in hard copy. And I stayed in that job for as long as it took to watch the whole series.
Amazing. Who is your favourite character?
Um, they all are in different ways because I feel like there's a little bit of me in each one of them. Um, Certainly at the time, probably Joey most of all, just made me laugh all the time. And I would have liked to have had that freedom of just sounding, like you're not very intelligent, but not caring about it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, you might remember then the episode where Monica and Chandler are going through an adoption process, and Joey is set with the task to write a letter about Monica and Chandler. But he discovers the thesaurus and he writes, they are humid, prepossessing Homo sapiens with full sized aortic pumps, when really he just meant to say they are warm human beings with big hearts, which would have been much less complicated, I think. So Joey really became a victim of the terminology war and has ended up getting himself tied in knots, and that's absolutely what we can relate to in the voice world. So that's why we're here today to unpack different terminologies.
Fab, let's go for it.
So let's start with a nitty gritty one. How about anatomical terminology? So, why do we need to know, or is there benefit to knowing some anatomical terminologies?
Certainly, if you're wanting to have a better understanding of the instrument that we're working with, I'm not sure that our student necessarily needs to know all the anatomical terms, but if we're going to be talking to people in the field, so ENTs, speech therapists, or voice scientists, if we're going to read literature or books or papers studying the voice, then yes, we probably do need to know the anatomical terms because that's what will be used. That's the kind of language that's used in those contexts.
And especially if we send a student off to get a scope with an ENT, that letter back tends to use some of that jargon. So for us to understand what's actually written and not get a Joey Tribbiani letter in our hands, then it can be really useful to understand some of the words that are going to come up. And some of those might be things like superior and inferior. So what did they really mean?
Well, they're just medical terms for above and below. So, for instance, my eyes are superior to my nose, and my mouth is inferior to my nose. So we would talk about organs. There are some labels, like there are some, like we talk about the superior laryngeal nerve. That just means it's coming from above. The recurrent laryngeal nerve is called that because it goes into the larynx twice. So quite often the medical labels are functional and sometimes they're actually talking about what they connect to. So connecting from one place to another. So like the thyroid to the hyoid or the thyroid to the cricoid.
What about lateral and medial?
So medial in medical terms always is in reference to the middle of the body. So if you get a line that comes down the middle, cutting you in half, so that from you've got the left side and the right side, so that line in the middle is considered the medial line. And so if something's lateral, it just means away from the medial line. And if it's medial, it's towards the medial line or it's at the medial line.
So when we had Kerrie Obert on a couple of weeks ago talking about how to sing with twang, she was using the terminology LMN, standing for lateral to medial narrowing. So that would refer to the throat walls or the pharyngeal walls moving towards that midline to make it narrowed.
Yes, and then away or out or towards or sideways in order to widen. Yeah.
Kerrie was also talking about APN, which refers to anterior to posterior narrowing. So, what does anterior and posterior mean?
So I think most people know posterior is the back of the rear, and then anterior is the opposite of that, which is the front. Yeah. So my nose is anterior to my spine. Spine is posterior to my nose. Yeah.
And when Kerrie was talking about the APN, then she was talking about using the tongue to move from the front to the back to create a type of ring, for example.
Oh, so narrowing.
A narrowing, yeah.
Yeah. So making the space smaller. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's an awesome book, isn't there? It's on our list for BAST training. The Anatomy of Voice, which I think is by Germain and Germain. And they talk about sagittal planes, frontal planes, and transverse planes. And it's an awesome book because it's heavily imaged, which is really great to be able to see those things. So, what are we talking about with sagittal planes, frontal planes, and transverse planes?
So when we're looking at the body and we're dividing it up or we're dissecting it, we need to sort of know which perspective we're looking at the organ or that body part from. And so these terms help us understand. So, for instance, sagittal plane, this divides the body from left to right. So, if I've got an organ that has been sliced sagittally, it means that I'm looking at it from the side. Whereas if I have a frontal or coronal plane, then it means that I'm dividing it from the front to the back. So I'm either looking from the rear or I'm looking from the front at that organ or slice of histology or the tissue. Transverse is really dividing the organ or the body in halves, top to bottom. So if I'm looking at a slice of an organ, then from a transverse or horizontal plane, then I'm looking down or up at that particular organ or slice. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So quite often when we're looking at images of the larynx, we are looking from one of these perspectives. If you're looking at illustrations, quite often they'll have the front view, and then they might slice the larynx in half in a transverse plane. So now we're looking at from the front or from the back, but the larynx has been sliced down from the top to the bottom. And we can also do it from the front to the back, so we get that side view as well. So that's really just what those planes are for, so that we understand what perspective we're viewing the body or organ or structure from.
We've also got sub and supra. So if we talk about it in terms of pressures, we've got subglottic pressure and also supraglottic pressure. What do those things mean?
I usually just transfer that into upper and lower again. So it's from underneath or from the top, which is maybe slightly different to superior and inferior, but they're very similar. So if we're looking at the glottis and we have pressure coming from underneath, that's subglottis. So it's just before the glottis starts underneath. And then supra means we're looking at the pressure that's sitting on top of the glottis in that area.
And that's kind of the same for the suprahyoid and infrahyoid muscles. So, infrahyoid being the ones that are underneath the hyoid bone, and the suprahyoid being the ones that are located above.
Yes, exactly.
something that we can actually add to lateral and medial is the terminologies unilateral and bilateral. So, what do they mean?
Yes, well, these are really useful, particularly when we talk about the vocal folds. So we've obviously got these two bands, and sometimes we have pathology on one or on both. So if it's on one, then it's unilateral. If it's on both vocal folds, then it's going to be bilateral. So conditions such as vocal nodules, for instance, generally present bilaterally. So you'll have a nodule on either side. Occasionally, you'll have a condition like a cyst or maybe a polyp, which irritates the other vocal fold. Even though it's unilateral, it may create what's called a contact lesion, but you wouldn't say that that was a bilateral polyp or cyst. You would just say there's a contact lesion on the other side as a result of the irritation, that the original pathology set up. Yes, so that's how we would use unilateral and bilateral.
I've said on this podcast before that reading some of the medical names for muscles or parts of the body sound a little Jurassic or like Harry Potter spells. So, how can we get to terms with how muscles are given their names and remember them?
Not really straightforward because I don't even remember all of the names of say, the tongue muscles because I just don't need to use it that often. But around the larynx, it's quite interesting because a lot of the laryngeal muscles are named after the two structures that they connect. So, if you are talking about the cricothyroids, that's the cricoid cartilage being connected to the thyroid cartilage. And the thyroarytenoid muscle connects the inside of the thyroid cartilage to the arytenoid cartilages on the back. So that can be useful. So there's a lot of muscles that have hyoid in them. So genohyoid, sternohyoid, thyrohyoid. I think, that, and you can pretty much guarantee that the hyoid bone is involved because there's a lot of muscles that actually attach or originate from it. So yes, if you see thyro, then it'll be to do with the thyroid cartilage. Crico, it'll be to do with the cricoid cartilage. Hyo will be to do with the hyoid bone. Sterno will be to do with the sternum. And cloido is something to do with the clavicle. So the clavicle's the collarbone. So sternocleidomastoid. The muscle starts at the clavicle and the top of the sternum, which is the bone that runs down between the ribs, and then ends up at the mastoid process, which is at the bottom of the skull. Yeah, sometimes you can figure out what a muscle's attached to when you know the bones, and it's useful to understand that muscles have what's called an origin and an insertion. So this is where they attach to either the bone or the cartilage. So the muscle will originate from one bone and insert into another. The origin side is stable and generally immobile, and the insertion side will be more mobile when the muscle contracts. Now, you don't have to necessarily know which end a muscle originates or inserts, though usually it inserts into the bone that's furthest away. But it does make sense when you look at the actual movement and actions. And if you really want to geek out on anatomy and physiology, then understanding which end the muscle is the origin and which end has the insertion will help you understand that movement. So if you have a muscle that has its insertion into a bone or cartilage, it means that that will move towards the other structure. But if it is the origin, then it stays put and the other structure will move towards it. And it can be really confusing, in particular when it comes to the hyoid bone, because A, there's a lot of muscles that attach into it, but some of them insert there and some of them originate from there. And in some cases, names of muscles can provide clues about the origin, but it's not always definitive. And some muscle names can include terms that suggest where they're attached to, but there are some muscles which you have no clue, such as the vocalis muscle or the digastric. So you've got no idea where those are. That doesn't really give you much of a hint. And it would have been really great if they had been a bit more systematic in the way that they labeled muscles, so we would know that, oh, for instance, the first term will always be the origin and the last one is always the insertion, but you can't necessarily rely on that, unfortunately. So it does mean that you, if you're wanting to be geeky, you will have to learn the muscle names and the origin and insertion.
In one of my performance contracts, I had to sing in German, and part of that study was to work with a phonetics teacher to make some of this language more relatable so I could figure out how to shape things, how to actually pronounce the words in ways that I could recognize. So, is learning some of these terminologies more down to definition and finding our own reference points for them, or do you advise that we use terms superior, inferior more exclusively?
I think it depends on the context. If you're delivering a presentation at a conference, then you're going to have to use that terminology. It'll be expected, especially if it's a research scientific based conference. If you're talking to your students about these concepts, then no, you're going to either use the lay terms or just more descriptive terms. Yeah, so I think it's got to be appropriate for the context.
Jean Callahan has a book called Singing and Science, Body, Brain and Voice, and in one of the chapters on registers, she says how one of the most vexed areas with regards to registers is the different terminologies employed by scientists, voice pathologists, spoken voice teachers, and singing teachers. And there was a list that was collated in around 1964 by Myrna et al. I think I've pronounced that okay. And that list had 107 different names that were identified as being registers. So I thought, if you're up for it, Lynn, shall we play a bit of a game?
Oh, why not?
Not one again that you're going to pull out in the festive period, but all in the name of fun. So we've touched upon this a little bit in our episodes on the best vocal exercises for, and they're quite popular episodes actually. So listeners, if you haven't heard those yet, I'll pop a link in the show notes for you to go and join the bandwagon on that. So why don't we play a little back and forth? Let's see how many names we can come up with for all of these different registers. So let's start with fry. So I'm going to go first. Fry.
That's cheating. M0.
Pulse.
Creak.
Slack folds.
Oh, haven't heard that one. Kardashian sound.
Yeah, I love that. I'm out. So yeah, I think you win that one. Kardashian sound. I wonder when that's going to come up in the literature.
That'll be interesting. Probably already has.
Yeah, true. Let's go on to chest voice, which is quite a common one. So M1.
Low register.
Thick fold.
Spoken speech. Yeah, speech.
Thyroarytenoid dominant.
Or TA dominant.
Or TA dominant. You can't have that. That's
Modal.
A heavy mechanism.
I'm sure there's a French word for it. Patron.
Okay. Yeah, not heard of that one before. Muscle layer dominant vibration.
No way.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just.
You're making that up.
Well, maybe.
Yeah, I don't think I've got any more.
No, I don't think I have any more either. Let's go on to head voice then. M2.
Oh, loft,
Upper register.
thinfold,
Cricothyroid dominant.
CT dominant.
Oh, you're taking that one this time. Okay, adducted falsetto.
Oh, falsetto.
Ligament layer dominant vibration.
Where do you get these
I'm shouting that one out to Chris Johnson on his registered stuff. He talks about it being a ligament layer dominant vibration.
from? Right. Um, I don't think I've got any more.
No, and to be honest, Lynn, I am sort of cheating because I've written all mine down.
Oh, yeah. Is that?
What other names can we think of in general that might come up? So a flute.
Well, that would be for what I would call falsetto or whistle tone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And is flageolet or flagellate in that as well?
Flagellate, I think, is head voice
Okay.
in some literature.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the whole falsetto thing is quite confusing because
Yeah.
in some pedagogy, falsetto is the term for male head voice, which actually has both, CT and TA, muscle engagement. Whereas other people talk about falsetto in terms of that whistle or flute-like register where there's no TA engagement. Yeah, so
Yeah.
that could be stiff folds is another one, or ligament dominant, or yeah, ligament vibration. There's something to do with the ligament is another one for
Mm-hmm.
that register.
Yeah. And there's also confusion in the terminology as to whether female voices also have falsetto or whether it's just exclusively male.
Oh, I didn't realize there was confusion. So what's Minnie Riperton when she goes up into that
Yeah,
register?
I think some people think that's head voice. I mean, for me, I think everybody has falsetto and everybody has head voice, which for me is a stronger version of falsetto. It's got more closure.
Hmm. Well, as I understand it, falsetto from an anatomical point of view, the vibration is happening at the ligament level
Mm,
and it's happening all along the vocal fold and the vocal folds are stiff.
hmm.
So it's just the sort of the epithelial aspect of the vocal fold that's vibrating as the air comes through.
Right.
So we're not getting any kind of wave or bottom to top closing. It's just hitting
Mm,
together. That's as I understand it, from voice scientists who've talked about it.
mm,
Yeah, but there's also that middle register, isn't there? That
mm.
bit
The bit in the middle. Yeah, mix.
passaggio,
Uh, chest dominant mix.
transition,
Bridge.
head mix.
Break, which is a little bit of a funky term for some people.
Yeah. Or that expletive gap in my voice.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. And then we've got different types of like belting. So I know from the work that I do in musical theatre, we talk about traditional belt.
Oh, what's an example of that?
So for me, traditional belt is aligned with the sounds like Judy Garland in Babes in Arms when she's singing Johnny One Note, or something that's a little bit of a lower belt, up to C5s, D5s, the sort of era before like 80s, that sort of thing. Chicago, Wonderful Town. We kind of have a traditional chest dominant sound compared to something like contemporary belt, which is going higher up. Think Mean Girls, F5, G5 sort of areas where we might be using a different strategy.
Ah, okay. Yeah. That's it, not an area that I know very much about, to be honest. But I was interested to hear recently a couple of people talking about the fact that there isn't just one type of belt. I certainly
Yes.
didn't clock that. I mean, I think I'd clocked it in terms of instinctively, but not from a functional point of view. Because obviously in the contemporary world, you've got the sort of belt that you might get in gospel versus the kind of belt you might get in rock versus some of the R&B, soul, even pop singers, like Jessie J, for instance, versus someone like Jennifer Hudson.
Yeah. And we're dealing with sound perception at the end of the day, aren't we? So we have different types of belt, whether that's a chest dominant sound that we pick up or whether it sounds a little bit more heady. We're just going by our ear. We don't fully know actually where a singer is setting themselves up or physiologically what's happening. We're just going by perception.
Or the other thing too is that physiology plays a big role. You've got a thicker lamina propria, if you've got maybe hypermobility, that might impact what the ligament can do. If you've got a certain length and shape of vocal tract, that might give you access to certain harmonics that other people don't have, so all that sort of stuff can impact the access that you have to different vocal qualities.
I'm just pressing the pause button on the podcast for a very brief moment to invite you to book your free BAST call. If you've been thinking about joining the BAST community through one of our courses, but you just don't know which option is the best for you, then why not book your free Zoom chat with our very own Kimberly George, who has all the answers. Head over to basttraining.com/book a call/ and click that big blue button. That's basttraining.com/book a call/. Now, where were we?
So if there really are 107 different names for registers, do we need to know them all, and when is it appropriate to use certain ones?
Well, I think as a teacher, it does probably mean that we need to have a wider range of terminology, and also to be able to connect how that relates to what you understand in terms of function. And then obviously when you have a student in front of you, you have to be appropriate to what that student needs or wants, or what's appropriate to the style of music that they're singing. Not every student will want to know all the terminologies, but if you're working, say, with a musical theatre student, they will. It's part of their job, really, isn't it? To know how to deliver these different types of belts for the different auditions that they might do. I think also if you're wanting to read the literature again, have discussions with other pedagogues, then having a broader understanding of all the potential, maybe not all of those hundreds, but the ones that are the most common, like pretty much the ones that we've covered today, so that when you're listening to someone else talking about these different vocal qualities or registers, that you can translate that into what that means for you and your voice.
Yeah, can then just become a bit less overwhelming as well when you know that a lot of them are referring to the same thing. It just depends who's saying it. Is it the student? Is it a voice scientist? Is it somebody who's coming from a physiological background? So it then has a little bit more meaning rather than just being all up in the air, tomato, tomato sort of idea.
Yeah, so for instance, the system that uses mechanism 0 through 3, that stems from a much more scientific approach where they like numbers, they like to be able to measure things and create a criteria. Whereas if you're speaking to a singer, they may feel like there's more vibration in their chest. And so calling that chest voice or chest register totally makes sense from a physical point of view. And then when they go up higher into the upper range, it feels like it's gone into their head. And so when we're talking to our students, that's probably going to be much more useful to get quick access to a perspective, of where that sound feels like it's being generated, even though it's not. It's just, as long as the teacher makes sure that they're explaining that this is a vibratory result of the region that they're singing in, and it's not coming from their chest and it's not coming from their head, then I think that's way more useful to a student than it is to say, oh, you're now in mechanism 1 and now you're in mechanism 3. You're having discussions with scientists, that might be the more appropriate language to use.
I've got a couple of terms here which I'm not putting under any particular category, but I'd like to get your opinion on them. The term holistic can be a bit divisive. Some people really love it, some people really don't. What do we mean when we talk about voice being holistic, and why do we use it?
I don't know if I've ever used it necessarily in that way. I talk about taking a holistic approach to voice, which means that it's not just about what's happening in the larynx. It's also related to what's happening in the mind, what's happening in the rest of the body, because any injury to a different part of the body might have an impact, for instance, on the position of the larynx or on tension around the larynx in the muscles. Or if someone doesn't think they're good enough, is worried about making lots of noise because they don't want to be noticed, then that's going to have an impact on their sound making. And so if we as teachers don't consider that, and I certainly, hands up, I used to just focus on technique and not look anywhere past what was happening at the throat area, we might be missing, a trick or two and not really serving the student as well as we could. Yeah, so for me, holistic is more about understanding that it's a whole body experience when we sing. And of course, when we perform, it's definitely a whole body experience. So what we eat might have an impact on our voice, whether we sleep or not, as well as obviously our mindset and our physical health and well-being. That's how I use it.
Yeah. What about the term support?
Oh, yeah, it's not my favorite word.
Really?
Yeah, I rarely ever use it. I only ever use it if a student says it feels like they've supported something. Over the years, and I've been doing this for a very long time, I've asked different people, from different genres, different pedagogies, methodologies, different fields. What does support mean? And I tell you, pretty much as many people as I've asked is the amount of answers that I've received. And I feel like support is a result rather than the origin of the process or part of the process. When everything's really balanced, it feels like the voice is supported. But if I go chasing what that support is, because I think, and this comes very much from understanding how different singers have different breath management processes. So if I go focusing on, you've got to support this, I feel like the student can easily end up going down the wrong track. I will do things that might result in that, but I won't say to the student that that's what they're doing, that they're supporting.
So what sort of things could lead you to having a feeling of support?
There's a great strategy that I learned from Ed Blake, the physio from Physio Ed, where they get you to engage your transverse abdominis in just the right amount by placing your fingers, just a few fingers widths down below your belly button, and then imagining that you're just trying to pull in away from your fingers just a little bit, because you don't want your lower abdominal area to touch your fingers. It's not a violent contraction. It's just a very gentle one. And so I use that as what might be deemed as a support strategy, because when we over engage the respiratory muscles, then there's just too much pressure, subglottic pressure, for the vocal folds to be able to perform in a balanced way.
Mm.
So if we engage the transverse abdominis in the just right amount, now the vocal folds have enough pressure but not too much subglottally, and then they can vibrate and oscillate in a more balanced, optimal way.
Mm.
And someone might go about saying, well, that feels really supported. And I also work on just balancing the whole mechanism. And then it means that when the balance is there between TACT and airflow and extrinsic muscles, and what you're doing, in terms of shaping your vocal tract, actually that thing that people call support just seems to kick in. And I'll have people say to me, oh, that feels really supported. And I find that's, for me, much more satisfactory rather than them chasing my perception of what support is, because I might feel it quite differently. And as we know, what we feel isn't necessarily a correlation to what's going on mechanically. Because a lot of people feel like when they say the sound ah, there's a lot of space in their throat. But in actual fact, when we look at the vocal tract, it's actually much narrower than we are, say, on an E.
Mm.
So telling someone to open their throat or get support isn't necessarily going to be a useful strategy. It might as an imagery. But I don't think it, if you're chasing it as a physiological or technical strategy, then I think people quite often get themselves tied up in knots.
And can we talk about the idea of the open throat for a second? Because it's something that we might come across a lot, whether the student says, oh, that feels really open, or we read it. So what do you think singers are usually referencing when they say, my throat feels really open, or when a teacher instructs to find an open throat?
See, once again, I don't think that's really what's happening. And I think Kerrie Obert has been able to demonstrate that quite clearly in all the scoping that she's done over the years, where in actual fact, it appears that the pharynx is narrowing as we go higher. And so is actually opening that area the right strategy? I don't use that. If I want more space in the F1 area, I will use the tongue. So I'll get the tongue to shift, or I'll use the larynx. So I'll get the larynx down or the tongue sort of more forward so that it creates more space in the oropharynx area. It's almost like we're contradicting what's happening in the throat when we're telling somebody to open their constrictors, because in actual fact, maybe closing them is the actual strategy that they need. Yeah, I think it comes from, well, it definitely comes from the classical world. And maybe most of the time when people are thinking about that, they're thinking about a lower larynx rather than a wider pharynx.
I wonder if it's also a strategy for helping a singer to work less, in terms of if they feel like things are constricting in their throat, is to build on imagery perhaps of we've spoken a bit before about hand fans and the gesture and how that can actually help to let go of something. So even though we might not physiologically be doing that thing, the sensation is actually we've let go of a constrictive sensation perhaps.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with it in terms of imagery, assuming that that student responds to imagery.
Sure.
So, and in that case, it might be better to use the hand gesture of saying, open up the sound, rather than telling the student that you're opening their throat, because maybe that's not what's happening. Maybe they're actually disengaging tension in the tongue, or maybe they're lifting their soft palate, or maybe, they're dropping their larynx. So that might be a little bit more, relevant to somebody in terms of who responds to imagery, but not necessarily helpful to somebody who's more kinesthetic.
Lynn, do you call yourself a singing teacher, a vocal coach, a voice teacher, or do you have another term?
When I was focused on technique, I called myself a singing teacher. Now I call myself a vocal or performance coach, or even a mindset coach sometimes as well, depending on who I'm talking to.
So, what really is the difference then between a singing teacher and a vocal coach? And does it matter?
I think if it matters to you, it matters. If I'm working with singing, then I probably prefer to call myself a singing teacher. For me, the term coach implies that we're coaching, not teaching and educating. I think that came from accompanists who ended up coaching vocalists with repertoire. So for me, coaching is much more about being that supportive guide rather than actually educating and training. So that's my take on it. I have no problem though with whatever someone wants to call themselves if they're comfortable with it. I think we also need to think about SEO when it comes to being found on the internet. If you are saying some sort of word that nobody would be looking for, like most people who want to have singing lessons will look for a singing teacher, then you need to at least have singing teacher, sporadically throughout your website. Otherwise, people are not going to pick you up. The other thing too is that for me, a voice or vocal coach has more of a spoken implication. Certainly a voice coach would be somebody, for me, who works on diction, voice, actors, presenters, anybody who wants to speak in public. For me, that would be voice coaching. What do you think?
It makes sense for singing teacher to be in there when we are training the singing skill. Vocal coaching seems like it has an additional holistic involvement, i.e., coaching you through how you use that skill onwards out of the studio as well. And I do think that we have to keep in mind, as you say, that SEO, if people are going to be searching for a singing teacher, that's what they're going to enter. So if we have vocal coach in our names, like I do, but I didn't really think that through, to be honest. But we were having this discussion, weren't we, at the recent Vocology and Practice conference, and it's quite interesting. But yeah, I think if we are singing teachers, singing teacher is fine. And I like the idea of voice teacher, but I do think it has implications of more spoken elements as well. So I agree with you on that.
I don't think there's any hard and fast rules. At the end of the day, that's why I say I think it needs to be what you're comfortable with as the practitioner.
And one last one, resonance. What does that word mean to you?
Oh, the big one for last. Yeah, good one. Thanks.
Just so we can end it like swiftly.
Yeah, exactly. Resonance. For me, it's related to what's happening in the vocal tract in terms of sound production, something that can be measured in hertz, related to the vowel and what's produced as a result of that whole power source filter theory.
Okay, great. See you next time, Lynn. Jokes.
Oh, it could also mean related to the tone and the richness. I think it really depends on where you come from. It seems to me that from a scientific research point of view, resonance has a very specific implication. But maybe in the performance singing world, it might mean something else. Yeah. What are your thoughts?
So for me, resonance is more of a resulting sound rather than the process. It's how the sound has been enhanced or boosted.
And I think the important thing, and this is with terminology, full stop, is that you have to figure out what something means to you, do some research, talk to other people, read and find out, what the general consensus is, so that when you're reading, watching, listening to other people talk about this, you can tell where they're coming from. So if a voice scientist who's been measuring formants and looking at resonance, you'll understand what they mean by it, versus a singer who says, I want to have a warmer, richer resonance. You realize that, okay, their approach to resonance is not going to be the same as the scientist's approach, so that you can be adaptable and flexible, and also, be able to communicate at all sorts of different levels and understand at all sorts of different levels. And the other thing which I think is really important to take away from this kind of conversation is the fact that there's no one absolute right answer. And every time we think we've got it, someone will come along and move the goalposts.
Yeah, some bastard always comes through and makes us feel like crap.
That might be you. I just think, oh, is that relevant or not? Shall I take it on board or not? And do I believe them or not?
I like that. I like that approach better, Lynn. I'll try my best to be in that ballpark next time.
Yeah. And also, is it useful or not? So for me, whilst I understand the mechanism system, it's not useful to me unless I'm talking to somebody who uses that system as well to describe registers. Otherwise, I don't use it in my teaching at all.
So we have gone through quite a few terms today, but if you had to give one overarching message to all of our listeners about understanding and using these terminologies, what would that be?
Keep an open mind.
Chill the F out. So lastly, Lynn, what's coming up with BAST?
Oh, very exciting times. So right now we are transitioning the 20-hour course to an online self-paced course in 7 different modules. So I'm very busy doing that, creating all the lessons and all the quizzes that go with it, etc. And we're doing a beta test on that at the moment. So we've got some people in there who are giving us feedback as we go along. And then we are coming up to the end of our 2nd module of the level 5 course and about to start getting ready for our 3rd module starting in April. And also we're going to be like, people can come on board if they want to start at the level 5 on the level 5 course in April. So yeah, and then I'm also gearing up to have a break over summer.
Nice. You very much deserve it. So roll on, summer.
Yay.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you, Alexa. Great conversation as always.